In the work of Alexander Galloway, the book Gaming Essays on Algorithmic Culture, he first tells us that video games are actions performed by both an operator and a machine, which we have already discussed. And he also tells us that these actions are performed on two levels, the diegetic and the non-diegetic level. So now we're going to see what these two levels mean and how we can use them when analyzing video games. So the diegetic level is the game's total world of narrative action. So all the characters, the events, the dialogues, anything that is part of the fictional world represented by the video game, all of that is part of the diegetic level. So for instance, talking with a different character or shooting an opponent in Fortnite or your simulated city in SimCity, this is all part of the diegetic level. So what is the non-diegetic level then? It's anything that is still visible on screen, that we still perceive as players, but it's not really part of the fictional environment. The score, for instance, some video games still have a high score, particularly games from arcade games from the 80s and 90s, they had a high score. Well, that number, the high score, is visible on screen, but it's not really part of the story of the game. But also the save points that some games still have, so specific areas or points when we can save the game, or even accessing the menu to save and load the game or changing some settings. These are all part of the non-diegetic level. So it's part of the game, but it's not exactly something that concerns the fictional world of the game. So this notion is not new, obviously. The distinction diegetic and non-diegetic is actually borrowed from studies in the humanities and literature, from film studies and so on. So in a movie, for instance, when watching a movie, we see quite clearly the difference between diegetic and non-diegetic. For instance, when we watch the story of and the characters sort of talk to each other or move around in the environment, this is all part of the diegetic level. But sometimes you might get, for instance, subtitles in a movie, and it is part of the non-diegetic level. The characters cannot really see or interact with the subtitles. The soundtrack, for instance, of a movie or even of a video game is part of the non-diegetic level. It's something we can hear as spectators or players, but it's not part of the story. So Galloway argues that the actions that are performed as part of the functioning of a video game take place around these 4 points: the operator machine, diegetic and non-diegetic. The operator and machine essentially operate and perform their actions either on the diegetic level or the non-diegetic level. So we're going to see now how these different configurations can take form. Let's say we, as the operator, the player, are playing Assassin's Creed, or let's say a role-playing game such as Final Fantasy. We move around the environments, we interact with other characters, we engage in battles and so on. These are all part of the operator diegetic acts. But let's say that while we are playing the game, we need to pause the game, or so we press, let's say, the start button and on our controller, and we put the game on pause. Or let's say that we need to change something in the game settings. Or let's say that we need to access some menus that are part of a fighting scene in games such as Final Fantasy, for instance, role-playing games such as that. Sometimes when you are in a fighting scene, there is a sort of extra layer of information that a menu that you need to interact with in real time in order to have your characters perform certain actions, or to, let's say, improve some of their statistics and their abilities in order to pass a certain stage and so on. So these are all part of the operator non-diegetic actions, because we are actually acting on a layer of information that, while being visible on screen, is not really part of the fictional world that is being represented by the game. It's not something that the characters of the game will be able to see, essentially. So how these actions also take form on the side of the machine? Well, the machine is acting on the diegetic level, for instance, whenever they are running the 3D world of a video game. Let's say you're playing Assassin's Creed, you interact with a character, the response of that character, the dialogues, the animations of that character, they're all performed by the machine. That's the machine operating on the diegetic level, acting on the diegetic level. But the machine is also sometimes loading a new section. The device will be, for instance, connecting to the internet if you're playing online. Sometimes those actions might even become visible, for instance, if the internet connection drops and there is a network lag. So all of these are machine non-diegetic actions. The machine is working on a level that doesn't pertain the fictional narrative world of the video game. But it is still essential for the game to function, to keep going. Now, some games really stress much more the operator diegetic actions. For instance, in a game like Assassin's Creed, most of the actions are performed at the diegetic level. But there are some games that are actually really flaunt, in a sense, the operator non-diegetic actions. Returning to the example of SimCity or games or some role-playing games, most of the actions performed, for instance, in SimCity are about making choices in menus, opening different menus, navigating options, changing some settings that, for instance, regulate how your city is financed, how certain things of your city should work. So all those screens that open where you can make your selections, these are all part of the non-diegetic level. And part of the pleasure, if you like, of playing the game is precisely looking at all these sort of non-diegetic layers and operating at that level. Understanding game actions through this sort of 4 axes also enables us to look at some borderline cases that would otherwise perhaps not make perfect sense, or perhaps might not be seen as necessarily as part of a video game, or which we might not know exactly if they are, essential to a video game, or if they are sort of exceptional cases. Alex Galloway, for instance, argues that we might sometimes experience what he calls the ambience acts. Ambience acts are where a machine, for instance, operates on the diegetic level, and the character, the operator, for whatever reason, decides not to play the game, not to perform any action. So at the time, Alex Galloway was looking, for instance, at the game Shenmue, which was released by Sega on their console Dreamcast, a game developed by Yu Suzuki. At that time, it was a very experimental game which really sort of pushed the boundaries of technologies. In that game, something quite new was happening that was not entirely common at that time. The game was populated by a large number of non-player characters, so human figures that were populating these sort of fictional representations of a Japanese town in the 1980s. And all those characters were involved in certain jobs, activities, occupations, and they were performing those actions following the schedule of the day. So you might see them, for instance, opening their shop at a specific time, closing their shop at another time. And what Galloway argues is that if the operator stops performing any action in Shenmue while walking around the city, they will still see the machine sort of playing by itself, playing these non-player characters, acting on the diegetic level and the non-diegetic level to make the game function and keep living and keep playing itself. We are now actually much more used to see something like that. Many adventure games are populated by non-player characters that have quite complex patterns of behavior. So even if we are not necessarily playing the game, it seems almost as if the game is engaging in this ambience act. It is a feature that has also been explored by some artists who like, for instance, to run video game simulations where the player is not necessary anymore. The player doesn't have to perform certain actions. For instance, the independent game maker David O'Reilly a few years ago released the game Everything, which I encourage you to look at. In the game, everything, the player can switch their perspective to literally any 3D object visible on screen. But if they decide not to touch anything for some time, the game will start sort of playing itself, and they will switch perspective from one character to the other, from one object to the other, from a stone to an animal, and so on, and perform what Galloway called an ambience act. So I would like to argue that this is still a video game, even though it doesn't require the player to do some actions. But the actions are still being performed. It's just no longer from the side of a human being. It is a non-human being, the machine, that is playing, that is performing actions. So these sort of double axes allow us to really kind of look at what happens when we play a video game, what kind of actions are involved in the process, and also perhaps to explore and analyze some borderline cases where we might perhaps be a bit confused about what is actually happening there.